So this is starting chapter 5 of S2, continuous variables hypothesis testing. These final 3 chapters are significant ones and you'll get quite a few questions based on this. Chapter 5 is about continuous scenarios. Chapter 6 is about discrete scenarios and chapter 7 is about both of them. And the easiest way to start thinking about hypothesis testing is to think about something we all know about, even though you may not have personal experience, and that's being taken to court. Okay? So if we consider a court trying a defendant, in this country it's really important that we believe the defendant is innocent until proved guilty. The proof must be beyond all reasonable doubt before you can call them guilty. The trial starts off with the judge and the jury assuming that the defendant is innocent. That's how we work in this country. And when you are doing a hypothesis test, which could be, for example, you are testing a claim a manufacturer has that bottles of bottled water contain on average more than 500 millilitres or something like that. You always start off with a statement you are going to assume to be true, and that is called the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is assumed to be true, and that's what you start with. That bold bit there, can you write down? You always start with a null hypothesis, which we refer to as H0, that is 0 down the bottom there, and we always assume that's going to be true, and it's the equivalent in a court case of the defendant being innocent. And if we have a null hypothesis, we've always got to think as well of what they might be guilty of. And what they might be guilty of, that in our stats speak is called the alternative hypothesis, which is assumed to be false to start with, unless we find evidence that it isn't false. So the alternative hypothesis, which we denote H1, is the equivalent of him being guilty. In a court of law, what happens about how you decide whether someone's guilty or not is the evidence is all weighed up. The evidence might be forensic evidence, it might be witness statements, it might be all sorts of things. The evidence that we have all comes from statistical tests and observations. I'm only suggesting you copy down the bold bits there. If you want the rest of it, you can always print off the KRP later on. Okay?
Which chapter is this?
It's chapter 5. So the bold bits are still on the board at the moment. Okay? So, the evidence that we use to decide which hypothesis is true, the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis, has to come from the sample of items, whatever that we are looking at. And by assuming the null hypothesis to be true, which is what we said we always do, we assume the null hypothesis true, it's possible to calculate probabilities relating to our test statistics. So for example, if we sampled 10 bottles of water and calculated the mean capacity of the water in those bottles, if the claim by the manufacturer was true, we could work out some probabilities. And this will become far more sensible to you when we actually get stuck into it. And what we'd look at is some sort of critical value, such that the probability of exceeding that small value, if the chance of this, what we have seen happen, is smaller than that, then we say actually they're guilty, because it just couldn't have happened by chance. So what we're saying is 5% is deemed to be statistically significant. So for example, if our bottles of water that we sampled on average had less than 500 in it, and the chance of that happening by chance was less than 5%, then we would say the bloke is not filling his bottles properly. Yeah.
Is that like
a stated value that the examiner...
Any question will say at what percentage, yeah. It's usually 5%. If it doesn't say, it's 5%. But yeah, it will say in every single question what significance level you'll be using. Okay? If we were going to charge Rob Cornish with murder of Corey for any reason, hopefully we would not want to send Rob to prison, an innocent man, and we would want that 5% number to be, or Rob would certainly want that 5% number to be considerably smaller than 5%. If it's a 5%, it basically means if we tried Rob 20 times, because 5% is 1/20th, 1 out of 20 times we'd declare him guilty when actually he isn't. So Rob would want that number there to be far smaller. What Corey would feel about it, we don't really know. So, there's one thing I think that's you've already seen. This one here, this last bullet point here, if you do reject the null hypothesis, that implies you have no alternative but to accept the alternative hypothesis, which sort of makes sense, really, as we go. You either have to accept the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis. So there's a 6-step process that we go through, which is on your handout. So on your handout, the first bit where there's a 6-step process, that is going to be a key 6-step process. If you could cut and stick, I will pause the video just to give you time to cut and stick that 6-step process there.